On the same day that Hitler killed himself, Lee Miller and David Sherman took these photos in Hitler's bathtub at his Munich apartment. This video will discuss Miller's war photography and how her time as a model and surrealist had a profound influence on this work. Lee Miller was born in Poughkeepsie, New York in 1907. Photography was a part of her life from a young age because her father was an amateur photographer. Initially, she was on the other end of the camera as a model, first for her father and later in magazines. When she was 19 and living in New York, she was almost killed by an oncoming car and was saved by none other than Condé Nast, publisher of Vogue magazine. Nast supposedly commented, "Gosh, you've got the markings of a great model." Shortly after, she began her modeling career and quickly appeared on the cover of Vogue. During this time, Miller befriended many photographers and soon began to pick it up herself. However, when her image was used without consent by Kotex, a period product company, it effectively ended her modeling career in New York. From the recommendation of a friend, in 1929, aged 22, Miller moved to Paris to seek out American artist Man Ray, where Miller would become his collaborator, model, and lover, as well as establishing herself as an artist. Man Ray introduced Miller to fellow surrealist artists in Paris. Surrealism emerged following the horrors of the First World War and drawing on Freud's theories of the unconscious mind and dreams. Artists created uncanny and illogical images that are above reality as a way for the unconscious mind to be accessed, and Miller applied these ideas to her photography. Ray and Miller developed photographic techniques such as solarization to manipulate the medium in order to create a surrealist image. At this time, they worked so closely together that it is hard to decipher which artist made what image. A key part of surrealism that Miller used in her work was the idea of the found object, where easily accessible objects are reconfigured or combined to create something new and interesting. For instance, Marie Oppenheim and her object, a cup and saucer covered in fur, emerged from a conversation she had with Dora Maar and Picasso at a cafe in Paris. Picasso admired Oppenheim's fur bracelet and said one can cover anything with fur, to which she replied, "Even this cup and saucer." The movement adopted the saying as beautiful as the chance encounter of a sewing machine and an umbrella on an operating table to encompass these ideas, which was to seek the unexpected through the juxtaposition of objects. While in Paris, Miller sometimes worked as a medical photographer. Miller photographed a mastectomy, a surgical procedure where the women's breasts are removed. After the procedure, Miller, in surrealist fashion, asked if she could take the breast. She then placed the breast on a dinner plate and photographed it. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Miller was living in London with artist Roland Penrose. Not wanting to miss out on the action, Miller decided to remain in London rather than returning to the United States. To support herself, she began doing fashion photography for Vogue. When the Blitz started in 1940, Miller began capturing ruined remnants of ordinary objects destroyed by the bombing. In the spirit of surrealism, she captured the ruins with comedic and absurdist elements, the idea of the found object converted into finding the remains of bomb sites. Miller's Bridge of Sighs refers to the bridge in Venice of the same name, but now the bridge is created by a destroyed building. The Venetian Bridge was named as such because prisoners would sigh at their last view of Venice before being sent to their cells, perhaps recalling the feeling Londoners had of looking at the city when the sun went down, not knowing what a night of bombing could destroy next. The image of a nonconformist chapel is titled "One Nonconformist Church plus one bomb equals Greek temple." Like with Bridge of Sighs, Miller makes light of the emerging new architectural sites in London. Another image of the same church looks like the building is regurgitating its insides through the doorway. Some of these images were included in a book called Grim Glory: Pictures of Britain Under Fire. The photos were intended to show the heroic efforts of the British people during the Blitz. Miller's pictures feature predominantly in the Ironies of War section, which has a brief introduction that says, "If all that one saw was unrelieved tragedy, life would be unendurable in these besieged cities." Fortunately, the wanton behavior of explosives and blast occasionally produces effects that are ironical, freakish, beautiful, and sometimes even funny, although the irony is grim and the humor is threaded through with pathos. As an American citizen, Miller was prohibited from contributing to the British war effort. Instead, she captured the activities of women serving in the British Royal Navy, known as Wrens. Miller highlights the uncanniness of modern warfare by placing women behind fire safety masks and machinery as if they are a fashion accessory. In the 1944 image behind the site, Miller photographs a woman standing in front of a mounted gun. This playful image blurs the woman into the gun. Her smile perfectly aligns with the mesh of the gun sight. The metal below this appears like two breasts. Perhaps this image is commenting on the boundaries being crossed by men and machines during the war. Just days before D-Day, where American troops invaded France, at the suggestion of her friend David Sherman, Miller signed up to be a war correspondent for the US forces. Very soon after, Miller arrived at Omaha Beach to cover a story about a US evacuation hospital. Her first story was published in Vogue in August 1944, entitled "Unarmed Warriors," about the soldiers at this hospital. She captured pictures of nurses doing their daily tasks, surgeries, and many men waiting for treatment or waiting to be sent back to the UK. One burn victim asked Miller to take his photo because he wanted to see how funny he looked. Miller later noted that it was pretty grim and I didn't focus good. At this time, female journalists were forbidden from covering the front lines, so Miller was confined to the field hospitals. However, Miller unintentionally broke this rule when she went to St. Malo in Brittany for a story that was supposed to cover how the civil affairs team moved in after hostilities to get things running smoothly again. The press had published that St. Malo had been captured but not occupied, but in reality, the Germans had just been isolated from the mainland and had to be driven back into the fortress. Due to ongoing machine gun fire, Miller wasn't allowed near the action, so instead joined some soldiers by watching from a hotel window. One day, Miller tagged along a counterintelligence investigation of a French woman with her 3 children who had been imprisoned the night before on suspicion of colluding with the enemy. Miller wrote that when she was photographing the family, the mother kept posing with the youngest child in a Madonna-esque fashion. The woman's husband was a Nazi sympathizer, and she had been aiding German soldiers. The fighting eventually ceased in St. Malo, and Miller moved on to Paris. In a letter to Audrey Withers, editor of Vogue, Miller wrote that she won't be the first woman journalist in Paris by any means, but I'll be the first dame photographer, I think, unless someone parachutes in. Audrey Withers remained a confidant for Miller throughout the war. The liberation of Paris began on the 19th of August 1944 and lasted until the German surrender on August 25th. Upon her arrival, Paris was celebrating. Avenues were full of flags and people cheering. The arriving soldiers were greeted with kisses, cheers, and presents. After the celebrations had calmed down, Miller began looking up her old Paris acquaintances. She visited Dora Maar, Picasso, and Jean Cocteau. Miller continued documenting the Allied troops and the retreating German army through France, Luxembourg, and Germany. Towards the end of the war, with her friend and fellow journalist David Sherman, Miller visited the recently liberated Nazi concentration camps Buchenwald and Dachau. After the war, Miller, who was deeply disturbed by what she had seen, destroyed many of the pictures she took at the camps. She saved enough that the events of the Holocaust wouldn't be forgotten. Shortly after visiting Dachau, Miller and Sherman went to Munich and were staying at Hitler's apartment when the news of his suicide was announced. The pair had unknowingly taken a bath in Hitler's bathtub on the day that he killed himself. The bathroom's white carpet was soiled by the dirt of Dachau on the photographer's shoes. Nearly a whole roll of film was used on pictures of Miller in the bath. However, one of the most poignant images is one of the last, of a skinny-looking David Sherman uncomfortably sitting in the bath looking at the camera. Sherman was Jewish. The carefully aligned shower over his uncomfortable body holds a different meaning, considering that days before, the pair had witnessed the horrors of the concentration camps and the gas chambers. Shortly after Hitler's suicide, Miller wrote, "I'm extremely irritable quite often, and especially when I don't understand people. I'm inclined to scream when people try to tell me that the bombed-out Hofbrauhaus won't make me an interesting picture because it is all destroyed, and that there is no use photographing the local monuments because they are ruined. I'm busy making documents, not art." Whilst her photos captured the ugliest and most horrific moments of the war, it is hard to deny that her experience behind and in front of the camera heavily influenced her wartime work. Her son wrote that being a surrealist artist must be the only possible training to enable a person to retain their objectivity in the face of the total illogicality of war, to make sense of the nonsensical. At the end of the war, Miller struggled to return back to her home in England. Emotionally shaken and angry by what she had witnessed during the war, she felt unable to return. She continued to wander around Europe. Finally, after a few months, she returned home, permanently changed, in a time where PTSD was little understood or even acknowledged. Miller, like many people who witnessed the horrors of war, became prone to alcoholism and periods of depression. She continued doing photography work for Vogue until completely giving it up in the mid-1950s. Miller's only son, Anthony Penrose, said that his mother was extremely reluctant to speak about her time as a war journalist. He had no idea about the extent of her coverage of the war until he found the manuscripts of the Vogue articles a few years after her death. Lee Miller's war photography pushes painfully close to the brutal as well as absurd realities of war, allowing us to see the war differently than the facts. The images capture the vast experience of conflict, from the unintentional joys of new landmarks to the harrowing reality of concentration camps. Miller's ability to express all of these realities with depth and pathos was truly extraordinary.